SuckerPunch is one of my favorite developers in the game industry. They're the studio responsible for the original Sly Cooper trilogy, which is a series I really enjoyed, but it's their other IP, Infamous, that really holds a special place in my gaming heart. The first Infamous game was the first game I ever bought for my PS3. I picked it up alongside my PS3 as the PS3 I bought didn't come with a game bundled with it. Infamous and Infamous 2 are two of my favorite games I've ever played. I even put Infamous 2 in my top 10 games of the decade video, and the only reason the first game wasn't on the list was because it didn't qualify. I did like Infamous Second Son, but I don't think it's as good as the first two. So you can imagine my excitement when Ghost of Tsushima was revealed to be the next game SuckerPunch was working on a few years ago. And after a few years of waiting and eagerly anticipating its release, Ghost of Tsushima is finally here, and I can tell you, SuckerPunch has done it again. I played Ghost of Tsushima on the PS4 Slim on normal difficulty for one playthrough. There won't be any major story spoilers in this video, but there will be some minor spoilers for a couple side missions just so I can illustrate some of my points in some of the earlier parts of the game. So if you don't want to know anything about the story, then don't watch this video. It's not hyperbole for me to tell you that Ghost of Tsushima might be the most gorgeous game I have ever played. The beauty on display in this game world is simply mesmerizing. I can't tell you the amount of times I just stopped and took in the visuals for minutes at a time. The use of color in this game is striking, with fields of bright white or red flowers contrasting with the deep green of the grass and tree leaves. That is, if it isn't the trees themselves that have vibrant golden or red leaves like a flowing sea of beautiful color. And I do mean flowing. Everything in this world has motion to it. Tree branches sway in the wind as their leaves fall to the ground or get swept up in gusts around the player, and fields of grass move with the wind, making each field seem like an ocean of green waves. It's truly breathtaking, and the world feels more tangible and alive than almost any other game world I've ever played as a result. The lighting is incredibly stylized and blindingly bright during the day, while at sunset casts the world in deep oranges and shadows. The draw distance is fantastic, and some of the views that you come across while exploring the island or climbing mountains are just breathtaking. The game has a photo mode that is accessible at any time from the D-pad. I'm someone who never really uses photo modes in any games that I play, but I did take a few pictures in Ghost of Tsushima. That's how much I love the visuals of this game. Still, as beautiful as this game is, some of the technical aspects of the graphics aren't as great as the art direction. Some of the textures in the game aren't really that high res when you take the time to look at them up close, and while the game does have a stable 30 FPS frame rate 90% of the time, there are certain encounters with lots of stuff happening on screen that can make the game chug a little bit for a longer than you'd expect amount of time. But even though some of the environmental textures are a bit underwhelming, the character models aren't. Every character in the game has lots of detail in their model, even if the facial animations can sometimes look a bit weird. Animations in general are well done, particularly the combat animations. And the game has some very short loading times, probably the shortest loading times I think I've ever seen in an open world game. Like, they're so short you don't even have time to read the loading screen tips. That's pretty impressive. The sound design in this game is incredible. It's honestly one of the best designed games in terms of sound that I think I've ever played. The ambience of the world as you walk through it, from the wind rustling the leaves of the trees to the sounds of the waves hitting the shore, the shouts of the Mongols as you fight them, the clanging and ringing of swords against swords, and all the musical stings for actions you take in the world, like beginning a side quest, it's all fantastic. And the score is phenomenal. Like, this is up there with Doom Eternal in terms of being my favorite score of the year. The flutes, the strings, the percussion, the melodies, it's all so damn good. They even throw in some Mongolian throat singing for good measure, which is appropriate considering what the story is about. The music is so epic and grandiose while also being quite mournful, sad, and contemplative. It perfectly sets the tone for the awesome samurai experience that is Ghost of Tsushima. Ghost of Tsushima is set in 13th century Japan during the Mongol invasion of Tsushima. You play as Jin Sakai, a samurai and nephew to the island's Jito, aka leader, Lord Shimura. Almost all of Tsushima's samurai arrive to fight the Mongols as they land on Komoda Beach to begin their invasion, and the samurai quickly learn that the Mongols don't share the same views on honor and warfare. The samurai are completely defeated, Lord Shimura is captured, and Jin is struck by 2 arrows and left to die on the beach. But Jin is saved by a thief named Yuna, who dragged him off the beach and nursed him back to health. Jin is, for all intents and purposes, the last samurai of Tsushima who can fight off the Mongol invasion. So Jin must embark on a quest to gather allies and grow stronger as a warrior in order to rescue his uncle and save Tsushima. Jin is forced to adopt new, less honorable methods of waging war against the Mongols taught to him by Yuna in order to stand a fighting chance against the overwhelming number of enemies. And that's really where the core conflict of the story lies, not necessarily with the Mongols, but within Jin himself. Jin was taught his entire life by his uncle to uphold the samurai traditions of honor, and going against his uncle's teachings causes great internal conflict in Jin. And as the story unfolds, we see how different characters respond and react to Jin's new fighting style, with some calling him dishonorable, while others begin to view him as something more than a samurai. Eventually, Jin comes to be known as the Ghost, and as you progress through the game, the legend of the Ghost continues to grow until even the Mongols come to fear Jin. It's basically like Batman Year 1 if Batman was a samurai. But don't get me wrong, the story absolutely does focus on the Mongol invasion as well. Everywhere you go throughout the game, you will come across reminders of the ongoing war, whether it be a burned home with burnt bodies impaled on wooden spikes littered around the house, or one of the many Mongol camps you get to liberate across the game world. You really get the feeling that there's a large-scale conflict happening everywhere you go. The game has some really great acting, with no real weak links I can think of. Even the most unimportant NPCs have well-delivered voice lines. And the writing is also pretty damn good. The main cast are all fleshed out really well, and I genuinely became fond of most of them. I didn't think the main villain was super compelling, but I didn't think he was bad either, just not as interesting as I would have hoped. The story takes twists and turns that test the relationships between characters, with some being pushed to the breaking point in certain scenes that will leave you wishing for another outcome in a good way. And there are 2 different endings to the game, and both are great and really tug at the heartstrings. One thing I will say about the game's writing is that there's not much deviation in tone. The game is very serious, grim, and dark, which is completely appropriate given the subject matter. However, when a game is as long as Ghost of Tsushima is, having such a constant, consistent tone of bleakness can get a little tiring. I would have liked to have seen a bit more levity or hope in the game at certain points, just to try and balance out all the horrible, terrible atrocities that occur during the game. I mean, it never really got to the level of misery porn that, say, a game like The Last of Us Part 2 could occasionally reach, but there were definitely some scenes that made me go, wow, that's fucking dark. Like some of the shit that happened during Norio's story, for instance. Ghost of Tsushima will draw comparisons to games like Assassin's Creed, as it's an open world game with a historical setting, and at its core it doesn't do anything that different from the open world design that we've seen in so many other open world games. However, to write off the game as being just another open world game does a disservice to the amount of time, effort, and thought that's gone into trying to make that typical open world game design seem more fresh and interesting. When you're exploring Ghost of Tsushima's world, be it on foot or on horseback, there's no HUD whatsoever. There's nothing to break your immersion in the game's world. There's no minimap, there's no compass, and there are no map markers for you to follow. Instead, what the game has done is implement this guiding wind system to guide you to whatever your next objective is. Simply swipe up on the trackpad and the wind will manifest itself with visible streams of air, along with all the trees and grass flowing in the wind to point you to your destination. It's such a simple thing, yet it completely changes the way traversing the island feels from so many other open world games. I've been doing an Assassin's Creed retrospective series on my channel for a few months now, and I'm up to my 8th game in the series. And it seems that at this point, one of the main mechanics of an AC game is selecting a map marker and making a beeline towards it. It feels like I'm trying to complete a checklist of objectives, like I'm grinding in some MMO rather than engaging with the game world. But this seemingly inconsequential change that SuckerPunch has made with Ghost of Tsushima has done so much to keep that feeling of checking off a list as small as possible. And that isn't where it stops either. There are so many little things that SuckerPunch has done that help to alleviate the sense of repetition or predictability that sets in so many open world games. As you come across towns or survivor camps, you'll be able to speak with certain villagers who will tell you about something happening in the world, be it the location of a hot spring to increase your max health, or a Mongol camp to liberate, or a side quest to begin. You can reveal a bigger amount of the map by liberating Mongol camps in a way that's similar to synchronizing viewpoints in Assassin's Creed, but it's nowhere near as mindless or repetitive as climbing Ubisoft towers. And there's a third way to discover locations on the map, which is as you're riding around the island, golden songbirds will fly up to you and lead you to points of interest. You don't have to follow the birds, you can choose to ignore them, which is nice if you're not interested in going off of your objective, but it's such a cool and organic way of guiding the player to new parts of the world that I'm really surprised this kind of mechanic hasn't been thought of before in other games. The game does eventually start to run into that feeling of open world fatigue, but it takes far longer than most open world games I've played to happen. And some of the side missions do get repetitive, like a couple side missions that require you to liberate a certain number of Mongol camps spread out across the island, where each camp has the same extra requirements to complete each time, but it never dragged the game down that much for me. Your horse will instantly spawn right behind you when you call for it, and if you call for it while running, it will spawn and run alongside you, allowing you to jump onto it all without having to stop moving. You can also instantly pick up things in the world like flowers for dyeing armor while riding your horse without having to stop or get off it. And even though the game world is quite large, there's never that much empty space. There's always something to do or see within a relatively close distance to wherever you're located. Ghost of Tsushima oftentimes reminded me of Skyrim and Red Dead Redemption when it came to exploring the world. And just like those two games, I would often pick a direction to go in without having an objective selected and just go, just because I wanted to see what I would come across naturally. This sense of exploration is one of the game's greatest strengths. I would say that Ghost of Tsushima has 4 different types of quests, even though the game only has 3 different categories. And the game lets you know what rewards each mission will give you, which is something I can't believe other games of this nature haven't done yet. The first type of quests are the main story missions that progress the main plot. The second are the Mythic Tales. Mythic Tales are missions that begin with Jin being told a story about some sort of legend of Tsushima, accompanied by an incredibly beautiful and stylized cutscene. Mythic Tales either reward you with a new legendary move, which are incredibly useful, or an armor set. The Mythic Tales were some of my favorite missions in the game because most of them involve tracking down a specific person or location in the game world, but the game doesn't outright tell you where you need to go. Instead, it nudges you in the right direction and finds a nice balance of making sure you don't get frustrated by sending you on a wild goose chase in a completely wrong area, and letting you figure things out on your own without holding your hand too tightly. The third type of quests are the character-specific quests, where Jin will aid one of the main cast in their quest to resolve an issue in their life, be it getting revenge on someone who murdered their family or tracking down a student turned traitor. I really enjoyed most of these character quests as they did a great job of fleshing out the main cast, as well as just being an interesting side story in their own right. Each character quest had multiple parts to them, with some having as little as 3 parts to some having as many as 9 parts. And most of them took place across the 3 acts of the game, meaning you would be able to do a certain number of these quests in Act 1, then have to wait until the next act to continue their stories. The fourth and final quest type are just your regular one and done style of side missions. While most of these side missions boil down to go here and kill a bunch of bad guys, most of them had an interesting enough story that made me want to do every side mission I came across. Ghost of Tsushima's combat is very damn good. In fact, it's one of my favorite combat systems in any open world game I've played. In keeping with the samurai theme, the game has a standoff mechanic which allows Jin to call out enemies to come fight him in a one-on-one showdown. Then, once a standoff is initiated, you need to hold down the triangle button until the enemy makes a move to attack you. Then once the enemy has gone in for an attack, you can release the button and get an insta-kill as your reward for timing it correctly. And you can upgrade the standoff mechanic to allow you to chain kills together for a maximum of 5 kills. Enemies will try and fake you out, however, and if you release the triangle button at the wrong time, your health gets knocked down to almost nothing. Standoffs kind of remind me of the duel mechanic from Red Dead Redemption, and they never got old for me. It was always awesome to win a standoff and chain together a bunch of insta-kills. If you'd rather not go in the front door and get the whole enemy camp on your ass, you can use the stealth or ghost mechanics instead. For the first few hours of the game, stealth is pretty basic and honestly mediocre. All Jin can do is creep up behind enemies and silently kill them, but as you upgrade your ghost ability, stealth becomes both more enjoyable and a more viable option. Jin can chain together multiple stealth assassinations, he can use this game's version of detective vision to locate enemies, he can stab enemies through doors, crawl underneath floors or through cracks in walls, he can kill enemies from afar with his bow and arrows, use smoke bombs to disorient enemies for easy kills, or use things like firecrackers and wind chimes to lure enemies into specific spots. It's nothing you haven't seen before, but it is executed well. Even though I enjoyed the stealth mechanics, the sword fighting is where the game's combat truly shines. Jin has access to 4 different stances that you unlock as you progress through the game, and each stance is strong against a specific enemy type. You begin the game with only one stance, the stone stance, which is strong against sword-wielding enemies. You can use heavy attacks to chip away at an enemy's defense meter, and once broken you can go in for the kill with regular attacks. But if you're using the stone stance against an enemy with a shield or spear, then your heavy attacks won't be anywhere near as effective. So learning to use your stances effectively in combat once you've unlocked them is key. Jin can block or parry most enemy attacks, and he can dodge or roll away from the ones that he can't. Enemy variety is a high point of the combat design. Essentially, you have 5 different human enemy types. There are Mongol dogs that will try and grab onto your arm, but they're pretty easy to deal with. There are archers, swordsmen, spearmen, shieldmen, and brutes. But within each of these categories are different tiers of enemies. For instance, the swordsmen range from lowly bandits who are easily dispatched to regular Mongol soldiers who are a little tougher than the bandits to Ronin, who are probably the best swordsmen in the game. But those aren't all the different swordsman enemies in the game, and each type of enemy has a similar number of tiers within their type. And the game doesn't just crank the HP on each tier to make the enemies more difficult to defeat only because they have more HP. Most enemies have the same amount of health. There are exceptions like brutes or Mongol leaders, but for the most part, the reason an enemy type is more challenging to fight than another is because their moveset and AI is more difficult to fight against. This is how you do difficulty right, ladies and gentlemen. Combat does have one major flaw, however, the camera. This game does not have a lock-on feature, which does fit considering that the vast majority of encounters sees you fighting multiple enemies at once. Unfortunately though, the camera rarely pans out far enough to have every enemy in view, meaning you'll spend just as much time adjusting the camera around the battlefield as you'll spend actually fighting enemies. This can get pretty frustrating at times, especially when there's more enemies than normal in an encounter, and you'll frequently be hit by an enemy that attacks you from off-screen in these situations. I think an optional lock-on could have helped remedy this a bit, but ultimately I think just zooming out the camera a little farther would have greatly helped as well. It didn't ruin the combat for me or anything, but it definitely was a notable distraction in an otherwise stellar combat system. One other issue with the combat system is that sometimes switching between your stances, combat items, bows, arrows, and stealth items can be a little clunky, as it requires you to hold down one of the triggers to bring up a quick select menu, R2 for stances and combat items, and L2 for everything else. Then you need to either use the D-pad or face buttons to change whatever it is you're trying to change. And the ranged weapons specifically have different arrow or ammo types for each of your ranged weapons, so it can become a little bit confusing once you've unlocked a good chunk of these options. I can't really see an easier way for this system to work off the top of my head, but that doesn't mean it couldn't have been done a little bit better. Jin has multiple upgrade trees that he can choose from to gain new abilities and items. You gain the XP necessary for upgrades by basically doing anything in the world. If you find a fox shrine, you'll gain XP. If you defeat a traveling group of Mongols, you'll gain XP. If you complete any mission, you'll gain XP. And some of these upgrades are extremely useful, so choosing which ones to prioritize to suit your playstyle can be a fun part of the experience. There are a lot of different kinds of charms in the game, which can give you effects ranging from more health to enemies taking longer to detect you while in stealth. And you can come up with some pretty cool charm loadouts that can kind of break the game in some cases. Each armor set that you unlock comes with its own set of different effects and stats that are better suited for different playstyles. The ghost armor is obviously tailored towards the stealth aspect of the game, while something like the Tadayori armor is the best armor for archers, and you can upgrade each of your weapons and armor sets as well. The game also has quite a few customization options with different skins for your katana and bows, as well as different types of hats or face masks that along with your armor sets can also have different skins. And there's no microtransactions. Crazy, I know. Ghost of Tsushima is one of the PS4's best games, which is saying a lot considering that the PS4 has some pretty damn good games. And it's an excellent way of closing out this console generation of Sony exclusives. Ghost of Tsushima is one of the best looking games I've ever played, with an amazing sound design and score, along with a great emotional narrative with fleshed out characters and amazing combat. Even despite a few niggling annoyances, it's one of the year's best games, and if you own a PS4, I highly recommend getting it. I'm going to give Ghost of Tsushima a 9 out of 10. Ghost of Tsushima doesn't surpass either of the first two Infamous games to become my favorite SuckerPunch game, but it also doesn't have the same kind of nostalgia factor for me as those two games do. I'm really glad that this game has put SuckerPunch on the map finally, because SuckerPunch has always sort of been one of those studios that has always done great work, but no one ever really talked about them. But now it seems like they're finally getting the recognition they deserve, kind of like what happened to Remedy once Control was released. I hope Ghost of Tsushima gets a sequel, cause I'll be there day one. If you liked this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and commenting your thoughts on the game. Thanks for watching.